The bank was crowded that Tuesday morning, filled with the quiet sounds of ringing phones, typing keyboards, footsteps, and people waiting impatiently for their numbers to appear on the electronic screen. Emily Carter stood near the entrance, checking her watch for the third time. She was 26, already late for work, and had only stopped by the bank to deposit a check. She was thinking about how quickly she could finish and leave when she noticed an elderly man sitting alone near the large window. He looked to be in his late 70s, dressed in a dark blue jacket with neatly combed grey hair. His clothes were simple but carefully arranged, and his polished shoes suggested that he still cared about presenting himself with dignity. Yet something about him seemed different. He kept looking toward the bank employees, then down at the worn leather wallet in his hands, as if he were waiting for someone who was already late. Every few seconds, he rubbed his fingers together nervously. Emily tried not to stare, but when the man suddenly stood and began walking slowly toward her, she looked up. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a soft, trembling voice. Emily smiled politely and answered, "Yes?" The man stopped in front of her and glanced around the crowded lobby before lowering his voice. "Could I ask you something?" Emily nodded, wondering what he could possibly want from her. Then he said the strangest thing she had ever heard from a complete stranger. "Can you pretend to be my granddaughter for 5 minutes?" Emily stared at him, unsure whether she had heard correctly. "Your granddaughter?" she repeated. The old man nodded quickly. His eyes were filled with worry, and there was something almost desperate in his expression. Emily looked around the bank, wondering if someone was watching them or if this was some kind of trick. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," she said. The man reached slowly into his wallet and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He handed it to her with trembling fingers. Emily looked down and saw a much younger version of the same man standing beside a smiling little girl. The child appeared to be about 7 years old, and she was holding his hand tightly. Emily looked back at the old man, who whispered, "That's my granddaughter." Emily looked again at the photograph, then back at the elderly man standing in front of her. She still could not understand why a stranger would ask her to pretend to be his granddaughter, especially in a crowded bank where anyone could overhear them. The old man noticed the confusion on her face and quickly explained that his name was Walter Hayes. He lowered his voice and told her that his daughter had recently questioned whether he was still capable of managing his own finances. She had contacted the bank and raised concerns about his ability to make important decisions. Walter insisted that he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself, but his daughter wanted him to move into a nursing home and believed someone else should begin handling his financial affairs. The thought seemed to hurt him more than he wanted to admit. He told Emily that he had spent most of his life working, saving money, paying his bills, and making his own decisions. He might have been getting older, but that did not mean he had suddenly become helpless. Emily listened quietly as Walter explained that he had come to the bank that morning to deal with an account, but he was worried that his daughter had already influenced the staff. According to him, she had told them that a family member would come to help him, but the granddaughter she mentioned had not spoken to him in years. Walter looked toward the manager's office and said that he needed someone beside him, even if only for a few minutes, because he wanted the bank employees to understand that he was not completely alone. Emily asked why his actual granddaughter was not there. Walter looked down at the photograph and said that her name was Lily, but she had not spoken to him for nearly 4 years. He did not explain everything at first. Instead, he simply said that family problems had separated them, and that he had never stopped thinking about her. Emily felt uncomfortable about the idea of pretending to be someone she was not, but Walter's expression made it difficult for her to walk away. He was not trying to steal money or deceive someone for personal gain. He seemed frightened that the people closest to him were making decisions about his life without listening to him. "I only need 5 minutes," he said again, almost apologetically. "Just long enough for them to believe that I have someone here with me." Emily looked at her watch and realized she was already running late for work. But when she looked back at Walter, she saw a loneliness that seemed much bigger than the crowded bank around them, and after a long pause, she quietly said she would help him for those 5 minutes, not knowing that the simple decision would soon place her in the middle of a family story she had never expected to discover. Emily followed Walter toward the manager's office, still feeling nervous about what she had agreed to do. She kept telling herself that it would only last a few minutes. But the closer they got to the office, the more serious the situation seemed. Walter walked slowly beside her, holding his old leather wallet tightly in one hand. Before they reached the door, he stopped and took a deep breath, as though he were preparing himself for something painful. "Remember," he whispered, "your name is Lily." Emily nodded. "For 5 minutes," she replied. Walter gave her a grateful smile before knocking on the door. A middle-aged woman named Mrs. Peterson opened it and immediately recognized Walter. Her expression changed when she saw Emily standing beside him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I wasn't expecting you to bring anyone." Walter straightened his jacket and answered calmly, "I brought my granddaughter." Emily forced a polite smile and introduced herself as Lily. Mrs. Peterson looked at her carefully, almost as if she were trying to remember a face from the past. Then she stepped aside and invited them into the office. Once they sat down, Mrs. Peterson explained that Walter's daughter had contacted the bank because she was worried about his ability to manage his finances. Walter immediately became defensive. He said he had managed his money responsibly for decades and had never needed anyone to make decisions for him. Mrs. Peterson assured him that the bank was not trying to take away his independence, but they had to follow certain procedures when a family member raised concerns. Emily remained quiet, listening as Walter explained that his daughter wanted him to move into a nursing home. He believed she was more interested in controlling his house and finances than protecting him. Mrs. Peterson did not immediately agree or disagree. Instead, she reached for a folder on her desk and began reviewing the documents connected to his account. Emily noticed that Walter's hands had started trembling again. He looked embarrassed and tried to hide them beneath the table. Then Mrs. Peterson mentioned that Walter's daughter had also claimed he was confused about his family relationships. Walter's face suddenly became pale. He slowly reached into his wallet and pulled out the same old photograph he had shown Emily. He stared at it for several seconds before saying, "She thinks I abandoned my granddaughter." Emily looked at him with surprise. Until that moment, she had assumed the family problem was simply about money and independence. Walter's voice became quieter as he explained that his granddaughter, Lily, had been only 7 years old when the family conflict began. He said he had tried to stay involved in her life, but circumstances had made it almost impossible. He had written letters, sent birthday cards, and kept photographs of her as she grew older. Yet he had received almost nothing in return. Emily could see the pain behind his words, and then Mrs. Peterson quietly reached beneath the desk and placed an envelope in front of Walter, telling him that it had arrived that morning. And the moment Walter saw the handwriting on the front, his entire expression changed. Walter stared at the envelope as if he were afraid to touch it. His fingers moved slowly across the handwriting on the front, and for several seconds he said nothing. Emily noticed that his breathing had changed. The confident expression he had tried to maintain inside the bank was gone, replaced by a mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief. Mrs. Peterson watched him carefully and said that the envelope had been delivered that morning and that she believed he should read it privately. But Walter shook his head. "I've waited too many years for something like this," he whispered. "I want to know what it says." He carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. As he began reading, his eyes moved slowly across the page. Emily could see tears gathering in them. Walter stopped halfway through and pressed the paper against his chest. "It's from Lily," he said. Emily immediately understood why the old photograph had meant so much to him. This was not just a letter from a granddaughter he had not seen in years. It was proof that the little girl in the photograph had grown up and was finally trying to understand what had happened between them. Walter continued reading, his voice barely audible. Lily wrote that she had recently found a box of old letters hidden among some belongings at home. The letters had been written by Walter over many years. Some were birthday messages. Others were simple notes asking how she was doing and telling her that he missed her. Lily had also found several birthday cards that had never reached her. She had discovered photographs that Walter had carefully kept, including pictures from the years when she was still a child. According to the letter, her mother had always told her that Walter stopped caring about the family and chose to stay away. Lily had believed that version of the story for most of her life, but after finding the letters, she no longer knew what to believe. She wrote that she was angry, confused, and ashamed that she had never asked Walter for his side of the story. She also admitted that she was not ready to forgive anyone yet, because there were too many unanswered questions. Walter wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. Emily looked at him and quietly asked whether he had ever stopped trying to contact Lily. Walter shook his head. "Never," he said. "I just stopped forcing my way into her life." He explained that he had continued sending letters even when nobody answered. Eventually, he had stopped sending them because he feared they might cause more problems for Lily. He had kept every returned envelope, every photograph, and every card as proof that he had never forgotten her. Then Walter looked at Emily and said that the hardest part was not knowing whether Lily hated him or simply believed the wrong story. Mrs. Peterson listened silently as Walter folded the letter again. He placed it carefully inside his wallet beside the old photograph, and just as he was about to say something, there was a quiet knock on the office door, followed by a young woman's trembling voice, asking if Mr. Hayes was inside. Walter froze when he heard the voice outside the office. For a moment, he seemed afraid to breathe. Emily looked toward the door, while Mrs. Peterson slowly stood from her chair. The door opened, and a young woman stepped inside. She was in her 20s, with nervous eyes and tears already gathering on her face. Walter stared at her, as though he had seen a ghost. He looked down at the photograph in his hand, then back at the young woman. Even after all those years, he recognized her immediately. "Lily," he whispered. The young woman nodded, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. "Hi, Grandpa." Walter's face changed completely. The strength he had been trying to show throughout the morning disappeared, and tears rolled down his cheeks. He took one slow step toward her, but then stopped, almost afraid that moving too quickly might make the moment disappear. Lily looked at him for several seconds before saying, "I'm sorry." Walter shook his head. "You don't have to apologize." Lily wiped her eyes and explained that she had received the letter he had written years ago and had finally found the box containing all the messages he had sent her. She said she had spent the previous night reading them, one by one, and realized that the story she had believed for years could not be the whole truth. Walter told her that he had never stopped loving her, and that every birthday he remembered had made him wonder where she was, and whether she still remembered him. Lily began crying harder. "I thought you left us," she said. Walter gently replied, "I thought you didn't want me anymore." The two stood silently, realizing that both had spent years believing they had been rejected by the other. Emily quietly stepped aside, giving them space. Lily finally moved closer and asked, "Can I hug you?" Walter nodded, and she wrapped her arms around him. He held her tightly, closing his eyes as if he were trying to make up for every birthday, holiday, and ordinary afternoon they had missed. Emily watched the reunion with tears in her own eyes. She had entered the bank that morning, worried about being late for work, expecting nothing more than a quick deposit. Yet somehow she had become part of a moment that could never be repeated. Walter eventually looked over Lily's shoulder and saw Emily standing near the door. "Emily," he said softly. She walked over. "Thank you," he told her. "For what?" she asked. Walter smiled. "For being my granddaughter for 5 minutes." Lily looked at Emily and smiled through her tears. "If you hadn't stayed with him, I might have walked away again." Emily shook her head. "I didn't do anything special." Walter disagreed. "You stayed when you could have left." Emily looked at the old man and realized that sometimes kindness did not require money, great sacrifice, or years of friendship. Sometimes it simply meant noticing that someone was hurting and choosing not to walk away. And as she finally stepped toward the bank entrance, she looked back once more and saw Walter sitting beside Lily, holding the old photograph between them, while the two of them began talking about all the years they had lost and all the moments they might still have together.